I'll just start by saying what I'm going to cover today before I make some for me important acknowledgements. I'm going to start with a bit of an overview, kind of following on from Aaron about the athlete monitoring and decision making in sports and exercise. Anything where we're looking to make people fitter, healthier, perform better, and look at kind of conceptually how and why we do that. And for me, this will kind of then introduce the crux of what I'm going to talk about today, which is magnitude-based inference or recently decisions. Kind of an overview of what it is and how it works and why it might or might not be important or relevant for what we do, which is, you know, for me, I work with individual people who are part of bigger groups and I have to make decisions about whether they're fit or not or ready to compete or not. Obviously, because of that and the big year that we've had, there's probably a big debate to be digested. This is the bit that I'm probably most nervous for, so if everyone's happy for me to just miss all that out, raise your hand and we'll just forget about that and make your own mind up. But seriously, I'll then finish on what I think are some applications and recommendations for something that's quite clearly a hot topic. So I just want to thank the Congress organisers, ECSS, Stephen, the guys who've put this on. It's going to be a great week, and unfortunately I can't stay for the rest, but I'm sure it's going to be good. And to the guys at Catapult as well, thanks for spending all the budget on Aaron, Franco and John, because if not, then a small pond window like me wouldn't have got a chance to come and speak. The two people, there's three actually, the two people I really want to acknowledge before I start this is... oh, that shouldn't have flew there. Put that the wrong way. Is a mentor of mine, Dr. Matthew Weston, and Professor Alan Batterham, because I guess without their continued support over the years, everything that I'm going to speak about today would make absolutely no sense to me. It still doesn't. I just speak about it a little bit better now. So this isn't necessarily a conflict of interest per se, more than a bit of a spoiler alert, but kind of I'm going to talk about something where I'm going to have a clear lean towards one side as opposed to the other. So I just wanted to be clear and upfront about that from the off, to be honest, and let you guys kind of set your stall out and take what you want from that for now. Okay, so we should have probably spoke about this beforehand because I could have just missed this one out. There's a second paper from Aaron. He said every paper I put in I get a B, so I'm on 2. So look, we're invested in this process whereby there's some kind of outcome that we want to control, and I guess if you think about it from an exercise science point of view, that's normally a physical outcome. It's fitness or fatigue. It's these functions and consequences of the training process, right? And we get employed to work in sport or in universities to teach people about this, or even in the clinical setting in health, to try and be involved in this process and guide and prescribe and monitor and evaluate to be able to control that outcome to what we want. And for me, that all comes down to decision making, right? So because that we're responsible for this and people pay us to do this, we get thrown questions all the time. We want to know about how the body responds because of what we're trying to control. And we do that by monitoring the thing we think drives the response, which is the internal load, and the thing that we think which drives the internal load primarily, which is external load. And then we sit in our performance meetings and we get all these questions. So I've just finished my degree and I go out and I get a job and I'm working as an assistant S&C and there's a coach throwing these questions to me and I'm like, I'm going through my lecture notes and I'm like, we didn't do this one, shit. But it happens, right? And all of a sudden you're just there, you're live and you're doing it. And these are big questions, right? These are decisions. And you know, probably the biggest one, I guess, and I've always worked in team sport, is are we going to win or not? And, you know, let's just flip a coin and see. But these are all questions that ultimately people want an answer. People like a dichotomous answer of yes or no, but the world doesn't work like that. But at some point we have to make a decision on what we think. And that's kind of, I guess, how the whole holistic process would work. So we have a situation, we have constraints. So we need to train to get fitter, but we've already trained quite a lot. So the goal is to get fitter, but the goal is also not to get injured. So between the constraints and the goal, we can then have a process or a strategy. And a big part of that is the decision-making process. And intuitive humans, we use a lot of different sources of information to make decisions. And this is just an example of a few that are across a broad spectrum. A few that these for me are probably the main ones that I could think of. And depending on your knowledge, experience, backgrounds, beliefs, you're probably going to give a different weight into each one of these, but you're still going to consider them all. So we've got emotion, intuition, and experience, logic, and reason. These are what expert coaches get employed to do, because they don't know how they make decisions. They just make the right decisions. And it's because of all this deep psychological process that's nested in. Then all of a sudden we start looking at things like rational choice theory. Well, it can't be A and it's probably not B, so it might be C, which then leans on a bit of probability, likelihood, and heuristics as well, just general rules of thumb. And I guess where we sit as part of feeding back in this decision process is at some point we're probably collecting data, because that lends to what we manage and measure: external load, internal load, the training response. And when the coach asks us questions about, did we train too hard, is he going to get injured, are we going to win, they're expecting us to use that information in some way to give them an answer. They're like yeses or nos, to make a decision. So I guess that sort of sets the scene for where I'm going to put the importance on how we come to making those decisions and where everything else fits in. So from this point on, it's probably going to get very numbers heavy, right? But I just wanted to say before that everything that I speak about from this point forward, if everything that's on the screen now isn't right, there's probably no point in doing it. And I can tell you that because I've done that and I've got it wrong, and I believe that that is wrong. So if you don't have a good theoretical framework for what you're doing, backed up with domain subject knowledge, holistic support for the athlete that goes beyond what we do, which is just measuring fitness and training load, a strong relationship with the athlete and with the coach, a solid program, you engage in that training process, you're there in the gym, you're there on the field, you're working with them, and bigger picture understanding, then anything that I'm going to mention from now is probably not worth doing. So don't bother with it, just focus on these bits, because these are the bigger rocks. So for me, when you feed back in the decision-making process, it ultimately comes down to this. When you interpret data, you want to make a call on how big or important something might be. And kind of just breaking down the key components there, what do you mean by how important? Well, does it have board in real life? Does it make it an on-the-pitch difference? And then might be, well, we know that we never measure the same thing twice. And that's as simple as asking somebody how they feel now and asking them how they feel later. There's going to be a bit of variation in that. Look at body fat, so skin folds, I'll probably use that as an example. If we repeatedly measure skin folds, the reason why we do it 2 to 3 times is trying to eradicate the human measurement error. We never measure the same thing twice. So if you never measure the same thing twice, how can you be certain that what you have measured is what you have measured? And then when you try and consider those two together, knowing that everything changes, there's a bit of uncertainty, but at some point we need to say, is it going to make a difference in real life or not? You want to make a call on that, right? And that's some kind of probabilistic judgment, knowing that nothing is ever certain and nothing is ever impossible. And again, the weather is a brilliant example. It is going to rain tomorrow. That's a stupid statement, because nobody knows that. The weather guys might be able to predict it, but probability works where you can't get 0, you can't get 100. It's 99.9 recurring. And that's because the future is never certain, because you're not there and anything could happen. So let's put this into the sense, I guess, of working with athletes or patients, clients, and how this might look. And then this is where I'll try and introduce the concept of how something like magnitude-based inference might help us encapsulate these things to work on an individual level and make these decisions taking into account real-world importance and uncertainty as well. So you've got an athlete and you've measured them on something, and you observe or measure a score. So let's say again, let's go on the example of body fat, right? We've just measured someone's body fat with skin fold calipers, and we've got some of the skin folds as a bit of a surrogate indicator of what the body fat is. And then you keep measuring them again and again and again, and you're going to get a different measure every time. Another good example for this is counter movement jump. So look at jump height. We never jump the same height within the same session, between days, between weeks. It changes all the time. So in the first example of body fat, that's probably pure measurement error. In the second example of counter movement jump height, that's probably biological variation in our ability to jump. You know, the motor coordination and the pattern and the strategy that we use, potentially a bit of fitness and fatigue if we look over longer retest periods as well. So we've got this variability now, but theoretically, think about this like Groundhog Day, right? If you could do a test and then wake up and you wake up at the exact same day and do it again, that performance is always going to vary, or the measurement is always going to vary. And because of this, if we have an infinite number of a theoretical amount of repeated observations, we get this range of scores that we think that what we've observed is probably the best guess. Everything more to the left and right is less and less likely. So we've got a distribution. We've got a likely range of where we think the scores are going to go. And again, everything to the left and right is probably not as likely as what's going to happen in the middle. That's where we get a greater density. So we can probably capture the variation in performance to performance or measurement to measurement by looking at something simple, like a within athlete or within player standard deviation. And again, that's just trying to encapsulate the middle bit of that distribution, the typical response. Everything else to the left or right is typically high or typically low. And then just going back to just, simple maths 101, if we know what the standard error is or the typical error of estimate, we can work out what the confidence interval is for the observed score. And this is the likely range of the true value by a level of whatever, 80%, 90%, 95, 99%. So we think that on any other given day or any other given assessment, that the true score might lie somewhere within that distribution. So now all of a sudden we've got a measure or measures that can capture and bring in that uncertainty. Once we know that, we can decide to work out what's important and what's not. And that's just changed there to not only an observed score, but now a change. So we test somebody and we test somebody again. On any given testing session, there's variability. So you kind of work out the confidence interval a bit different. You times the typical error by the square root of 2 and it pulls it together. So now we've almost got a change and we can have a look to see whether we think it's important or not. Well, it's looking at the width of that confidence interval. A lot of it is over 0. There's probably still a chance that the change could be 0. And then the bits in black at the end, we're kind of not bothered about those because we think they're on the extremes of the distribution. They're very unlikely to occur. So how do we decide whether it's important or not? Well, there's probably a couple of things we can do. We ultimately need a threshold or a number to say, yeah, that's something that I'll pay attention to, or that's something that makes a difference in the real world. And we can do this a few ways. There's a distribution-based approach, or there's an anchor-based approach. So the distribution-based approach is probably something that you're all familiar with concepts such as the smallest worthwhile change, or Cohen's d. It's a factor of how different everybody is, the standard deviation between people, times 0.2, times 0.6 for small, moderate, large effects. Brilliant. Far from perfect. And that's why, for me, probably an anchor-based approach is a little bit better, because what we're looking for here is a robust, minimum clinically or practically important difference, or even expert opinion. And we would get these from I guess, giving it the hard sell, something like a really well-conducted validity case cohort, some kind of prognostic study where what we care about, like performance, is on the y-axis, and what we can measure, like training load, is on the x. And we can look at what change in training load gives us a change in performance that's important. What's an important change in performance? I don't know. The obvious one's winning and losing, but then now we're in realms of things that we'll probably never understand. And then again, everything I'm talking about here is monitoring an individual, and I'm going to start to make some very clear distinctions about what this is here and what is in research. Everything I'm talking about applies to monitoring and working with an individual in practice, not doing analysis for a research study where this has to be a lot more well justified. Sometimes we don't have that information in practice. It doesn't exist. So we have to try and pinch from little bits as best as we can to paint the picture. And actually the value and the opinions of an expert coach or practitioner, like Aaron said there about the swimming coach that could predict performance, there's something nested within that person's experiences and work over time that means that they might know or might not know what's important and what's not. So there's different sources of information we could use, and I'll go through examples later of maybe where these conflict or where they can come from. But once we decide if they are appropriate to use or not, we can set that as a threshold, and we can say, okay, well, there's the important threshold, plus or minus 0. If it falls within, if the true score, given by the range of the confidence interval, if that falls within the grey bit, it's probably not important. If it falls outside of it, in a positive direction, this also works negative, we can say, well, yeah, that actually probably is important. And now what we're looking to do is look at, well, what's the probability of it falling outside? And we're trying to quantify the area under the curve. It's that green bit there. And this, just going off basic frequentist statistics, is given as a continuous probability. And again, all the ingredients that we're using here, it's everything that we've already got. It's the observed, what we've measured, it's the threshold that we've decided on, and it's the typical error. And it gives us that continuous probability, the area under the curve, 0.86 of that, if you imagine the whole curve as 1. So this is a 68% probability that this change here, given measurement variation, and given the fact that we think that there's a threshold for important or not, there's probably a 68% chance that it is important. And then we could interpret that with common connotations. And this is where MBI probably gets a little bit of stick for using things like this. But these are synonymous with the International Panel on Climate Change, the guys who decide how we evaluate and describe the weather, because it might rain tomorrow. It's likely to rain tomorrow. It's very likely to rain tomorrow. And these thresholds are remarkably similar to the ones that are used in MBI. There was a study that was also done in Holland recently as well. And the likeness to these thresholds was incredible. This is definitely still open to debate, but what I'm saying is there's things in other fields that have adopted this approach as well. So, in a nutshell, that's, we can say that the differences possibly, and that was magnitude-based inference. Again, everything that I've showed you there, that isn't how you would use MBI to work out the effect of a training study, 30 people in control group, 30 people in the intervention group. It's very similar. Any statistic is the effect over the error. In a study, the error it's the group variance, it's a standard error of the difference or whatever of the relationship against the mean or the observed. In practice, the effect is what we observe, what we measure. It's our best guess. The error is the typical error, the within subject error, because we think that, given repeated performance, it could be anywhere on there. So there's similarities, but there's big differences, and that's going to be important for what I touch on later. So I've probably made the assumption that most people in the room have heard of MBI and used it as well potentially, and obviously there's been a lot of hot press in the past year, and this is something that it's probably taken up a lot of my time just trying to figure out what's going on. And to be honest with you, I'm not sure I'm 100% there. I never will be. I think it's probably the same as most people. But what I want to kind of give now is a bit of an overview and a digest of what I think we've seen. So 2006 MBI made its debut in the first issue of IGSPP. 2008, we get a response there from some Bayesian statistics saying MBI is trying to be Bayesian, and it's not. It's frequentist. It estimates confidence intervals. It's not about using prior information and generating estimation. It's about using frequentist statistics, which is wrong. That was followed up by the progressive statistics paper in MedSci in a response to say, well, actually, it's not wrong because a lot of people do this, and we're just pulling things from other areas of practice and trying to pull it all together. It goes quiet until 2015, when Alan Welsh and Emma Knight done the statistical review. Again, response goes in. And then there's a bit of dialogue there. And everything that's happening at this point of the argument is starting to touch on the mathematics and error rates. Something popped up by, I can't remember the name of the author. This is a preprint that's online. And this was in response to one of Martin Bescheid's articles, Will the Numbers Love You Back? Saying that actually, and this was again leaning on that whole, MBI isn't Bayesian, so you can't do what you're trying to do with it. 2018 is really when the shit hit the fan, for a better phrase, and Christian Sanani comes up with the paper in MedSci that, again, this is the one that I'm sure everyone's more familiar with. And this is leaning off the back of the Welsh and Knight review, saying that MBI has unacceptable error rates. There was a lot of dialogue around that as well. David Borg, Curran Everett responded then, Sanani put some response to them. Batterham Hopkins responded in a letter. Sanani responds back, saying, no, you're wrong. The Vindication article goes out online as a preprint on sportside.org, and that gets a lot of support from different practitioners and statisticians as well. And then even as recently as the other week, Scandinavian Journal, there's another hit on MBI. We're all doing it wrong, we're all doomed. And then the latest, which is that MBI is now magnitude-based decisions. Wow. Along the way, some journals decided to make a bit of a stance. So we lost MedSci, we lost JSS, but support, I wouldn't necessarily support or endorsement, but journals such as IGSPP and Science and Medicine and Football saying, well, actually, come on, if we use this properly and if we make the right interpretation and we don't fall into the trap of dichotomy, then this might be okay, but we've got to present it and do it properly. So I guess there's a lot there to take in, and honestly, I've probably missed some stuff, and if anyone's aware that I am, please tell me, because I need to know. I use this every day, right? But the key points of the debate, there's probably 4 or 5, but I'll try and synthesize it down into 3. So MBI uses a frequentist confidence interval as though it was a Bayesian credible interval with a minimally or a reduced, a flattening form prior. I'll go in a little bit more about what that means and why, but apparently that's wrong. And this is where the attacks come from, error rates and using MBI as Bayesian when it's not. So this comes in and says you can't do that because it's invalid. It's invalid to say possibly unlikely because a confidence interval isn't a credible interval. Okay, cool. Then the next one, and this is the main one that everyone's worried about when they're doing the studies, the MBI produces unacceptable error rates because the type 2 error reduces, but you greatly increase the type 1 error. And that's because the definitions of error are wrong. So we'll start with the top one and just try and have a little bit of digest on this. Now, what I will say is that the whole debate about what is a confidence interval and what isn't, this is far beyond anything that we'll ever see in sports science. Statisticians still argue about this now, and it's mind-blowing. So keep that in mind. And I'll try and do this as much justice as I can. So when you create a confidence interval, you get your mean, and you say, well, it might be from here to here. And what you're saying there is, if I could keep repeating this study 100 times, 95% of the time, or an infinite amount of times, 95% of the time, the true mean will fall within one of the confidence intervals somewhere. In MBI, we use that as a credible interval. And what a credible interval says is given the data that we've observed and some prior belief about where the true value might be, there's a whatever percentage chance that the true value is going to lie within this credible interval, a posterior distribution. So you can look at the difference between a confidence and a credible interval exactly like this. The credible interval uses the actual distribution and some prior information that you've had. So what might be your prior information about exercise heart rate? Well, it's not going to go below 0% and it'll never go above 100%. That's a weak or minimally informative information about where the true value might be because I span the entire range of what it could be. For a confidence interval, again, this is more about the repeated sampling and estimation. So you've got 100 confidence intervals there. The 5 that aren't in red are the 5 that were missed by the 95% confidence interval when you repeated the intervention or the experiment again and again and again. Keep in mind that we're not repeating experiments. We're extrapolating this to try and monitor an individual. So can confidence intervals be used in replace of credible intervals with a minimally informative prior? Well, that's what MBI does, but MBI didn't invent this. This is Paul Burton's work from 1994, something else again in 1998, and then repeated. You know, so this was a whole book that said actually, yeah, when you have a confidence interval, it's kind of amicable to a Bayesian credible interval where you have a weak or minimally informative prior. And even as recent as 2018, and you can just look at the data there, the confidence intervals are in black, and the credible intervals, minimally informative prior, are in red. And they're almost identical, laying over the top. And there was even a paper that looked at this in 2016 using Bayesian estimation and MBI. And what did they find? They found that there was no difference in the conclusion about the probability of a true effect between Bayesian and MBI. Therefore, we should be using Bayesian with confidence. Well, I'd flip that the other way around and say, why don't we just use MBI? Because it's easier to understand and compute in the first instance. And now, again, remember, I'm talking about monitoring an individual in practice. I'm not talking about extrapolating to a study. But like I say, again, the debate about what is a confidence interval is still ongoing. And even as recently, this is from Sander Greenland, this is about a potential rebrand of a confidence interval to a compatibility interval, to say what it probably represents is the compatible range of the given data there. You're not trying to extrapolate to other studies or repeated studies. Treat each study in isolation, and the compatibility interval, calculated the same as a confidence interval, shows you how compatible your data are with the model and assumptions that you've went with. Okay, brilliant. So I think that there's evidence there to suggest that if we do use confidence intervals as minimally informative compatibility intervals, we're not going to make a mistake, or we're not going to make vast mistakes, providing that we don't have the information. Error rate. So type 1, you believe there's an effect when there isn't, and type 2, you believe there's no effect when there actually is. Think about that in terms of the wolf. The boy who cried wolf told everybody there was a wolf, and they thought there was a wolf, but there wasn't. And then when there was a wolf, nobody believed him. Okay? So you've probably seen all the graphs. And really quick summary. On the left from Sinani, MBIs are bad, don't use them, look at these graphs. Actually, no, MBIs are really good, we have low error rates, and no, look at the red ones. Every time the dots are red, that means you get it wrong. So why does this happen? Well, if you look at null hypothesis significance testing, you make a type 1 error when you say the true effect is significant, but then you say, sorry, the true effect is 0, but you say it's significant, and it follows this kind of pattern. So then when you apply that to MBI logic, and use MBI as definitive. So if you say, with MBI, we've got a range of possibly, likely, very likely, almost certainly. If you start using possibly and likely as definitive, so if the true effect, there's nothing there, but your MBI says, oh, it's possibly substantial, then you've made an error. If you latch on to possibly and use that as, if you write, let's say you write the paper, you write a whole discussion about why the experiment worked, because there was a possibly small effect, then of course you've made an error. But that's not how MBI works. And I can say that because I've used it like that before. I got it completely wrong. We draw the line at likely substantial, and we say, oh, well, do you know, for ease of presenting this graph, anything that was likely, I'm just going to put a star above and call that substantial, and we'll go from there. Caffeine improves performance. That's not how it works. If you use MBI properly and still encompass the uncertainty in the measures, then when you find a trivial effect, it's likely trivial. You understand that it also might be possibly substantial. It might be important. So if there's differences in the way that MBI proponents and opponents define error rates, then there's going to be differences in the actual define errors. There's going to be differences in the rates themselves, which is why we're going to get these discrepancies. I'm not leaning on any side at the moment here. I'm just saying this is what it is. This is the evidence. So going back to the arguments, MBI uses confidence limits as credible intervals, and this is wrong. Well, actually, it's been done before, and it's been proven that it's not only wrong, it's actually quite synonymous, and there's a lot less computational power and also theoretical power that goes into it. We don't need to pick a minimally informative prior, which we can take, could spend all of our time doing that. We're not even good at picking the smallest worthwhile effect, never mind this. These are the complicated things. So MBI produces high error rates, but that's based on no hypothesis significance testing logic. So if we interpret effects properly, if we get a likely small effect, we also need to look at what's the chance it might be trivial. Because if it's likely small, there's probably a chance it's also possibly trivial. It's nothing. And obviously this is what causes the difference in the error rates, because if one person says that type 1 error is this, and another one says it's this, then you're going to get these differences. And then I think, again, it's probably also important just to remember what we're doing here. With MBIs, the whole debate is about a group or a study, where you're extrapolating from a sample, but we're just looking to describe observed data. Your point estimate, it's the mean of a sample versus observed. We've got planned and purposeful sample size. We've got an N of 1. We deal with one athlete, or one athlete who's part of a group. Where's the statistical error term coming from? So we actually, in practice, we use MBIs, we use these inferential statistics more as descriptive statistics to not make inference on a population or a generalization, but to actually just describe what we've seen and what we've got there. So let me just give you an example of how that might work. So submaximal fitness testing in practice, we use it all the time. We've got a 4-minute bout of exercise, and we use that to measure exercise heart rate. And we think that if it's the same external load, it's the same 4-minute work, if heart rate goes up, then that might mean that we're not as fit, we're maybe fatigued, or we're losing fitness, because the internal cost is more for doing that same work. If it goes down, it might be a sign of freshness, preparedness, or even improved fitness. This is a great paper by Billy Hewlin, and Billy used the first 4 minutes of the yo-yo intermittent recovery test level 1 in rugby league players, and what he found was a strong correlation between the actual yo-yo performance score and then the heart rate in the last minute of the 4 minutes. So we can compare with some confidence between players and also within players as well, because the players who had a greater change in yo-yo were the ones who had a greater change in exercise heart rate, and again, it went down, it went lower. So we can use it to compare within players as well. And how that works, obviously, you've got the yo-yo intermittent recovery test. I'm sure it's something that people are quite familiar with. Measure heart rate during it. It's a 4-minute test. We'll start at the first level, and then we'll progressively work up and up and up. And for us in rugby league, athletes tend to sort of average out in that 4th minute at around about 85% maximum heart rate. In their study, they reported a test-retest reliability, a coefficient of variation, or in this sense, because it was from heart rate, it's in the percentage unit of around about 2.4%. And we wanted to check this and test this ourselves. And we found something that was nigh on synonymous. So in a test-retest study with 14 players, we found, after accounting for a mean change of 2.8 percentage points, we found a typical error of around about 2.6. So how do you get a bit more power and strength in the typical error? Well, Billy was dealing with rugby league players, so were we. We can just pool them, combine them together. So now from a sample of getting close to 30 people, we're probably quite confident that in exercise heart rate response to the first 4 minutes of the yo-yo, or the last minute of the first 4 minutes of the yo-yo, typical error in rugby league players is around about 2.5 percentage points of maximum. So how can we use that? Well, here's our pre-season report, and we'll build that up and start to bring in magnitude-based inference. So we've got the pre to post change after pre-season. We can see that some people went up, with some people a lot didn't happen. Anything obviously to the left of the chart means that it was a lower heart rate, so potentially a better response. So if we use that typical error now and work out an individual confidence interval like we spoke about before, we start to visualize and encapsulate a bit of uncertainty in those changes. This is brilliant, this is what we want. We want to look at what might it have been if we'd have measured it on any other day, knowing that when we did do that at the beginning of the season, it went up or down randomly, typically, by 2.5 percentage points. So now what's our threshold for practical importance? And this is where I think the real debate should be. This is where I think the hard part is. But where do you put your foot in the sand and say what's hard and what's not? If you go back to think about what we're doing here, we're monitoring change in individual. Billy produced this graph, and it was on the y-axis you've got the change in yo-yo, on the x-axis you've got the change in exercise heart rate. And if you just digitize that, you can get the points out, and we can work out from simple linear regression an equation that says, well, what change of heart rate gives you a change in yo-yo? And there you go, you've got a change in heart rate, and what on average in this study, not predicting, this is about what happened in that study, what was the associated change in yo-yo? So if you think about the yo-yo, you can only run 40 metres at a time, so we can probably round all those numbers up to 40. And then we can talk about them in a bit more real-world units, because 40 metres is one shuttle. So now we're looking at the change in yo-yo. So we're trying to find out what's important change in heart rate, and the question now is what's important change in yo-yo? Where are you looking for that? I don't know. For me, the yo-yo's got 8 shuttles per level. So if you improve by 2 shuttles, have you improved? Probably not, you're on the same level. If you improve by a level, have you improved? Well, yeah, you've improved by a level, but that's probably too conservative. For me, I'm looking around about here because I reckon half a level improvement in the yo-yo signifies something important. Because if you change by 4 shuttles, you're at least halfway, or you have crossed closer to the next speed level than the last one. This is open to debate, but we spoke to coaches about this for years, and it makes sense to them. And what I'm looking at now is the 90% confidence interval of that. I'm looking at the 4 shuttles of a minimum. What do I need to get on average or typically to be confident to know I'm going to get an associated 4 shuttle improvement? It's around about a percentage, a loss of 3% in exercise heart rate during the last minute. And this reminds me of a paper that Stephen done a few years ago. Different athletes, and this was high intensity interval training in endurance athletes. But Stephen had 3 different groups, and what they found here, among a lot of quite cool findings, is that there was different physiological adaptations associated with the different groups. The difference in exercise heart rate between the 3 groups was around about 2 to 3 percentage points. So neither of these methods are perfect for what I'm wanting to do, but now I've got 2 different sources of information that I'm trying to pull together to stick my neck out and draw the foot in the sand. So we can again go back to our report that we're trying to produce to say whether players got fitter over pre-season or not. And we can draw that. We make the zone for 3 and we say they've got to be greater than minus 3 percentage points or they probably didn't get fitter. And after that, again, using the principles that I spoke about before, we can apply MBI. Now what this is just a probability. The straightforward probability is a percentage that they crossed that line over that way, that they're not in the grey zone given the test-retest error. That ranges from 0 to 100 or 0.111 to 9.99999. So what might lend to coaches? Well, we could probably colour it in and give them a bit more of a visual. Green, you're good. Red, you're not. Then again, remembering some of the limitations of MBI or the way that MBI is used, we're probably not articulating the full story here. So let's give those full percentages and full probabilities. Now look at the top one. That guy there was, he's possibly improved, so he's fitter, right? But then he's also 27% trivial. So we can articulate that in a full chance. He's possibly improved. It's possibly the same. And then, of course, now we've got some unclear inferences because the chance of it being fitter, less fit, or the same is too much that we can't make a call either way. So we should probably uncolour code them just to avoid confusion because we're not making a clear call there. We're not calling anything that it has or hasn't worked. It's unclear. We don't know. And that's, again, another key thing about the debate. MBI's opponents think that unclear inferences, when the true effect is substantial, is an error. For me, if you don't make the decision, you can't have made an error. You've not stuck your neck on the block either way. But then again, in practice, we're using a 90% confidence interval here, and that's just because typically what you get accepted in research, 90 or 95. In practice, we deal with quite a lot of noisy measures, and if you use 90%, you'll never find anything. And in practice, you don't want to make a type 1 error. You're scared of making a type 2 error. You don't want to potentially ignore something that might be there. So we can maybe loosen the constraints on that. And this is where it is up for debate, because now it's my opinion as a practitioner trying to apply science. So if I reduce the constraint on the uncertainty there, I'll reduce it down to an 80% confidence interval. And effectively for MBI, what this does is it just changes the threshold. So if it's anything between 10% and 90%, we're on the fence. It's got to be above 90 to be important. And again, this just lends to clearer reporting. We've got more clear outcomes now, but everything's possibly. We're just sat on the fence, right? But then, I guess amidst all that, that's probably less than perfect, because one assumption that we've made there is we've estimated the typical error as 2.5%, and we've gave that to everybody. And what's wrong with that? Well, everyone's got individual differences. So we're estimating the within subject standard deviation, but that's got between subject differences in itself. This is why anything I'm showing you now, you would never do it for a study, because a good reviewer would hammer you for it. And well, hopefully they would, else if not, you'd be embarrassed if it got published. I know, because I got one published before, and now I'm embarrassed of it. So, again, this is differences between what we do in practice and what's right for research. In research, we have to treat the statistical model with a bit more rigour. So 2 limitations here with everything that I'm showing you that's on the graph in the background is everyone's been given the same typical error, but that doesn't account for the guy who's very consistent or the guy who's very inconsistent within themselves. Secondly, we've done a test-retest study, and as Billy did, there was about 3 days between test-retest in pre-season. There's anything from 25 and up to 50 days. So we've increased the duration of that reliability study. So what's up for question is what's going into the model. Because if we're putting shit in, we get shit out, right, Aaron? That's one of his. So there's probably a better way that we can look at this. And again, this is just to finish up and show that how we can even make it even more individualised if we've got the inclination, time, effort and motivation. So I'll take one of the players out there who had an approximate 6% change. This time we can use his own data. We haven't got a test-retest reliability study anymore. We're using their own changes to work out what's noisy and what's not. So here's the first 13 weeks of the season. The first 10 were pre-season, where we were training. And the last 2 weeks, weeks 11 and 12, late 11 and 12 were the first 2 weeks of competition. So just looking at this guy's own, we give him a personal regression, right? We stick a line through there and we give him his own typical error. So we look at how far away those dots are from the line, and then we can apply the typical error, which is the error bar is what you see. That's just a straightforward standard deviation. And then from that, we can look at that change as a whole. What's the effects of 10 weeks of pre-season, taking into account the measurements that we made every single week? Well, this 6.4%, then we're using, again, we're going to use the 3% has been important. So heart rate, it's very likely lower. It's possibly not, it's unlikely similar following pre-season. So we can probably say, yeah, we can be definitive there and say we got them fitter. What happened in season? Well, if we look at the average of these two compared to everything else, heart rate's now up by 2%. So is that important or not? Well, it's possibly similar. It's possibly higher for the first 2 weeks of the season. We're bang on the fence there. What we could probably say is that in that 12th week compared with the 11th, this 4% increase, possibly higher, unlikely similar. So now we're starting to bring in this uncertainty and practical importance. And right, this is an artificial example. You're never going to throw all this out with a coach. Coaches, half the time, the coaches I've worked don't even want to see the reports. But I need to have this in my head so I know that I'm not making an error when I speak to them based on what I think and what I've observed. So I guess just to wrap up, we owe it to everything that we do, to the athletes and coaches that we work with, to ourselves, to our colleagues, to our discipline, to understand the demands of training and competition and try and understand how athletes are responding or not so that we can make a clear call and manage them and get paid properly to do the proper job. In a world where we chase things that are practically important, we always want to find the signal. We've got to get rid of the noise first, then we've got to get that signal, the thing that was real, and say, well, did it make a difference or not? And that's a fundamental part of monitoring individuals. So for me, just summing up, I guess more going back to the debate slides, used properly, magnitude-based inference or decisions can help us evaluate the meaningfulness of a trend or a change, which, from experience, no doubt has a benefit when you then go in to the coaches' meeting because you've got a bit of armour in your arsenal because you've got some things that you've looked at, hopefully with rigour and confidence, that when you make a call or a decision, you've done that accounting for things that you think can affect the importance and uncertainty of that change. So when we say use properly, and this probably means for studies as well as monitoring individuals, obtain an estimate of the typical error, this is obviously for an individual, from a sample of athletes tested and retested under standardised conditions. The typical error is the thing that's going to change the confidence interval. We've got to be robust and try and have confidence in what we're using then. It's got to be done over the same period that we're trying to make the call, whether it's a day-to-day decision or a week-to-week decision. We need to gain consensus on a threshold or value for practical importance, and this is the thing that is up for debate, and this, for me, is probably one of the most challenging things, because the right way to do it, there's not enough information out there to use it. So we're always, in practice especially, we're left pinching from different pockets of information. When we're making calls, avoid dichotomy. It's not the athlete is fitter, the athlete isn't fitter. Embrace that uncertainty and bring probability into the decision-making process. And MBI helps you do that if you don't count likely and possibly as definitive. Try and use articulation as much as possible. Find out what works for the people who you work with. Try and present the probabilities. Try and present the words. Change the words if you want, as long as you're not publishing it. You're working with athletes and coaches. What does possibly mean to them? Where are they going to draw the line? So ask them and work with them. And use effective data visualization. That probably lends to a lot of not even our own understanding, but actually showing it to other people as well, and being able to take off as much information as possible. So is it all for naught? Well, for me, if we're following this checklist, it's something that we shouldn't fear, but we can embrace and bring it in as a powerful statistical tool. Thank you.